Okay, well, maybe I can do an introduction and we can get started. First, as you see the circulating information, there's one more behind the science session this year, and that might be the last formal activity we have for this academic year. So Stephanie's going to talk about the VA Tech Transfer Assistance Project, which now has a component in Cleveland in the VA Medical Center. And we're going to talk about medical illustration in the FES Center. That we know we provide medical illustration support for all of you. And if you want to partake of that, it might be interesting to see Emily, Caitlin, and Melissa also on the 17th at noon. Okay, we're very pleased and lucky to have an excellent speaker today, Dr. Brian Litt. He's professor of neurology, neurosurgery, and bioengineering at the Perelman School of Medicine and University of Pennsylvania. He does a lot of different things. So he's attending neurologist, co-director of the master's degree program in bioengineering at Penn. What about director of the Penn Epilepsy Center? Are you still?
So I actually don't do the master's program anymore since they opened the floodgates, and I just stepped down 3 weeks ago as head of the Epilepsy Center. I was going to tell you about that. Liberated after 10 years.
Okay, I'm not going to read any of the other ones because I'm not sure you do anything anymore, Brian. So
no, I don't. Yeah, that's fine. That was a good enough introduction, Bob. All right, so I'll put on some slides.
Hold on. So you're also very entrepreneurial. So you started companies and consulted for companies and licensed things to companies. And I just want to say that he and I and Steve Fenning and Andy Cornwell and some of Brian's colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania have a pending U54 proposal that's called Advancing and Developing Viable and Emerging Neurotechnologies, which goes to council next week. And we're have our fingers crossed and looking forward to getting that rolling. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say, Brian. I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you for joining us today.
No, it's really a pleasure. And, you know, they say the longer the introduction, the closer you are to retirement. So it was longer than I'd like, Bob. So I'll tell you, there's like a method in my madness today because, you know, I've had contacts with people like Rick and folks at over at the Cleveland Clinic. I've had interactions with Dominic Durand and a few other folks at Case, but I'm embarrassed that it's taken all these years to really get to know some of you folks in more detail, and I'm really excited to be working with you. So the tenor of this talk today is to talk about a few things that are important that are going on here, and also to lay some groundwork for some real collaboration, which I'm kind of excited about. And, you know, my brother-in-law is my best friend from medical school, and he's one of the vice chairs of cardiology at the Cleveland Clinic. So it turns out I go to Cleveland all the time. We married a pair of sisters. He's got a great wine cellar. So anyhow, that's all right. Enough idle chatter. Let me share my screen. And I think some of the themes will come clear. Can you see the slides, Bob? So I have a weird position at Penn. I have two primary appointments, one in bioengineering and one in neurology. And it's a very rare place that allows you to do something like that. You know, they say if you have two offices, nobody really knows where you are. So it's a big advantage. But Penn is a very collaborative place. Everything is very close together. And so it makes appointments and collaborations like this quite realistic. My area of focus is on translation of technologies into patients. I'm an epileptologist by training, and that's where my focus is going to be today. But I'd like to consider the same kinds of problems broadly, because I know the centers and the research at CASE is very diverse, anywhere from the central nervous system to peripheral nerves and bioelectronics. And so I think these concepts translate pretty well across divides. So these are my disclosures, and I show it with trepidation because I've worked with a lot of companies, helped start a couple, but profit has never been my main motivation for doing this. And it's a darn good thing, because so far with all this effort, I'm down $15,000. So I've never really monetized this work, but I'm really interested in things like point of care diagnostics. These are Jonathan Rothberg's companies. Butterfly Ultrasound, Hyperfine is a portable low field MRI scanner on a cart that people are starting to use. Tesseract optical scanning with multimodalities and things like that. And then in the informatics space, I really started my first work with companies with NeuroPace way back when they licensed our algorithms for their device. And that's been kind of an interesting journey, but suffice it to say, that's a company that took 15 years to go from being a startup to public. And so it's really been very interesting to watch that journey. I've not profited from that personally, but I have professionally in a big way in terms of getting things into clinical translation, and that's been exciting. You know, the work I do reflects an intersection. This is the Penn Epilepsy Center. So Kate Davis took over as head of the Epilepsy Center 3 weeks ago. She's awesome, and I hope you all will integrate with her a bit. She does a lot with neuroimaging and brain networks, and she's a lot smarter than I am. This is our lab over in the School of Engineering right across from the medical school. And Flavia Vitali, who does a lot with materials, and we won't talk about any of that today, is here. Kate with neuroimaging, and then a bunch of our graduate students and staff. And then collaborators that span people you know, like Tim Dennison, Danny Bassett for networks, Zach Ives, chair of computer science, and a bunch of neurology and neurosurgery people. So I wanted to share with you, this is what I think my clinic is going to look like in 2035 as an epileptologist. So 8 a.m., I have a new patient visit, and it's a computer referral with predicted new onset seizures in a patient. So the algorithms have looked through the patient's medical record, through their genetics, their family history, their metadata, and predicted that this patient has an 85% chance of developing epilepsy within 2 years. The question is, should the patient be on anti-seizure medication? 9 a.m., I have a return patient visit. This is a refractory patient for pre-surgical discussion. The patient is having their data compared against pre-surgical data compiled in a normative and surgical atlas from thousands of patients around the world to identify targets, and the patients to be scheduled for robotic intraoperative mapping and laser ablation. 9:30 return patient visit. Patient with new onset seizures failed one drug. Patient going to review their continuous subcutaneous EEG, their biomarker screen, and their fibroblast derived neuron drug screen for a treatment plan. And then 10:15, the final return patient is an artificial intelligence guided responsive neurostimulation visit. So to review the cloud-based stimulation, learning, teaching, and recording plan from this patient. The patient's upset that the device bothers her when she drinks alcohol and stays up late because it increases her seizure risk. The point here is that these things are all quite realistic, and there's a lot of science behind them already. The key thing that's missing here is leveraging the informatics, leveraging the data that goes by on the devices we have, leveraging the electronic medical record data, leveraging the science, and advancing it. So how are we going to do this? We're going to do it with hardware, materials, and implants, and we won't talk much about this today. We'll talk about informatics, cloud computing, some new devices, and data sharing. So if you're an epileptologist, there's interest now in the community in really starting to leverage a variety of data that's coming through. So there's outpatient data entered by the physicians. It's mostly unstructured. There's inpatient data, monitoring unit, EEG, telemedicine, wearable data, continuous monitoring, and all sorts of biologic data that we've only begun to leverage. So here's patient number one, the predicted probability of seizure onset. The problem is that we have a tremendous amount of data in our system, tens of thousands of patients, but all of their data in the electronic medical record. Our health system is now 9 hospitals and a bunch of outpatient centers across a large region, but there's no way to get at this unstructured data. For example, trying to figure out even what somebody's response to therapy is. You know, the physicians write in their notes, they had a seizure last Groundhog's Day on their mother-in-law's 5th anniversary, and it's very hard to get those data out. So we've been working with computer scientists on some new models using transformer models to actually get information that's allows us to do this at scale. And it's actually been pretty successful. So here's an example of having a group of 15 readers who are experienced clinicians mark patient records for things like when was the last seizure, do they have epilepsy or not, what classification do they have. And their agreement in general was pretty good at about 80% plus or minus, 80 to 83%, reading the medical records. We trained these transformer models and we asked them about the classification accuracy, seizure frequency, and when the most recent seizure occurred. And here's what you see. Here, these large boxes are the clinicians and their range of marking. You can see on average, they agreed on classification about 92% of the time. The algorithms were closer to about 84%. Seizure frequency, again, about 84, 85%. The clinicians were higher here at about 87. And most recent seizure, the clinicians were worse than the algorithms, but the algorithms had a much tighter spread. And if you look at the statistics, it turns out that they agreed about as well as the clinicians agree with each other. Not only that, we trained on 1,000 records and had a separate testing, holdout testing set. And it turns out that most of their learning took place after about 200 records. So this tells us that we can actually, through intelligent informatics tools, start to leverage patient histories and unstructured data in order to get information that will decide who gets a device, who's responding to therapy, who gets medications, when are they refractory. And one of the projects we have going right now, the definition of when somebody gets referred for surgery or a device is according to one study by Kwan and Brody, where they actually looked at about 300 patients over a period of, I think, 10 to 15 years. And one clinician, Martin, and his staff tracked those patients and saw how many were treated by one medication successfully, how many were treated by 2, and then subsequent medications. And he showed that if you failed 2 medications separately, appropriately dosed, and a combination of 2, that your chances of becoming seizure-free were less than 10%. You should go on to tertiary therapy. So we think that we can do that study at a much larger scale on thousands of patients. And instead of 15 years, that we can do it in a week. And this just gives you an example. We haven't done it yet. It's in progress right now because we've just gotten the big data poll. But this just gives an example on our pediatric epilepsy side. These are the number of clinic visits for patients with a particular genetic epilepsy. So each one of these on the vertical axis is a different patient, and each one of these little dots is their clinic visits over a period of 20 years. And you can see that if you're trying to understand somebody's clinical condition, you kind of have a time machine. You can go back to when they first presented and follow them forward. You can choose people for clinical trials. You can figure out when a device or other therapy is indicated, and you can look at outcomes. And that's pretty exciting because it's going to influence how we apply the therapies we develop and the technologies that we develop. And so informatics are key. This is an important area of investigation because the question is, then what are we going to do with the data? How are we going to put it in a place where we can work with it? How can we work across institutions? And we've spent a lot of time, Zach is the chair of computer science and Joost Wagenaar is one of our junior faculty members. And they've built a wonderful platform. We've worked on this together over the past 5 years to be able to integrate multimodal data and to share it over the cloud and run algorithms on it. There isn't going to be one platform that everybody uses, but likely a variety of platforms. And this is one that we're using across the institution and the campus here. It is open source, it's free. You can use it to work on your data. You can build components for it. And the data can be published, given the DOI, and made available for everyone. And we'll talk about that more later. We think that being able to share data across institutions is going to be key. Institutions aren't going to let people and companies monetize their data like Flatiron did with cancer data at our institution and a bunch of other places. They took in data and said that they would figure out which patients were available for which clinical trials, but they ended up monetizing it and selling it for $2 billion to Roche. But I do think if we're smart, we can find ways to mix data across institutions, federate the analysis through platforms like this and others so that we can work together and collaborate. And so this is built, it can handle imaging, time series, multi-scale data, clinical pathology, a whole variety of things, and put that in a data graph that can be mined and shared. Patient number 2 comes in, and this is a patient that has recordings as being mapped for epilepsy surgery. And we think that another area where we don't learn very well is from experience across centers. There are thousands of patients that have had epilepsy surgery, but each patient is an individual, and we judge what to do based upon the few clinical trials there are, but mostly based upon our individual experience or articles that are published from a single institution that may have, in a big institution, 100 patients, but in many like 20 or 30. And so this is a project where we've built a normative atlas of intracranial EEG activity and connectivity to define the seizure onset zone. And just taken data, in this case, just from 144 patients, taken out the electrodes that involved regions that generated seizures and left the other ones as quote unquote the normal electrodes, put them together, and then we're measuring patients, Z-scoring their activity in different regions against activity in this normative atlas. And we found these are just 3 examples from the paper where the Z-score identified the seizure onset region for surgery, the same as the clinicians did. And in one case where the patient didn't do well, the clinicians predicted that the seizures came from one side, but the algorithm Z-score showed that they came from the other side. The patient didn't do well because the one side was operated on. What's the point here? The point is that if you're evaluating somebody for a procedure, for a device, we ought to be able to learn from every other patient that's gone before them and from each implant that's done. So it's not just their medical records and not just their surgery, but, and I'll touch on this later, Tim Dennison and I used to talk about a scientific payload in every device. In every stimulator, every Parkinson's patient, every spinal cord patient that gets a device implanted, we ought to be able to get data out that we can share, learn about their illness, about the natural history, their physiology, but also about what works and what doesn't. We're doing the same thing with structural networks. This is actually a paper not from our group, but from Peter Taylor's group in the UK. One of his PhD students, Nishant Sinha, the first author, is now a postdoc with us, and doing the same thing by trying to localize structural networks. And we're working to match structure with function through putting electrophysiology and quantitative imaging together. And we think it's quite promising in terms of, in this case, showing a distribution, a difference between patients who relapsed with seizures or worsening seizures on this x-axis, compared to ones who did well based upon their structural connectivity. And we're using this information to kind of mimic epilepsy surgeries in silico to try to predict which procedure may be the best one for individual patients. And I think this work is quite promising. And this is work with Danny Bassett here, who does a lot of computational and network modeling. All right. What about patient number 3, defining the intervention? I just wanted to show a couple of slides from a patient who has been under my care and care at another institution as well. So this is a patient who at 22 years old had medically refractory complex partial seizures. You can see there's an asymmetry in the occipital lobe, but her vision was normal. Her MRI was read as abnormal, but they couldn't localize where seizures came from. She was monitored at an institution, this was in 1999, had a huge implant procedure, and they found that the seizures were localized over a broad region of cortex, and they did multiple subpial transection, which is a procedure that's rarely done now, where they essentially rake a probe, parallel to the cortex, and to try to disrupt connecting fibers. It turns out it doesn't do that very well. It just sort of macerates the cortex. And this is the atrophy she had. She had a reduction in seizures for about 3 months, and then they came back. Subsequent imaging showed on better imaging when she came to us in 2014, a bottom of sulcus Taylor type 2 cortical dysplasia. Turns out that here's the craniotomy that they had done, the craniectomy in this particular institution. They would remove the bone flap, put a lot of electrodes in. They did put a depth electrode back through this area that was abnormal, but they missed the region where the dysplasia was by chance. They didn't know it was there. The patient elected at that time, this wasn't 2014, the surgery was about 3 or 4 years ago. At that time, laser ablation was being done, at only a few centers. They went to one, not us, that did a lot of them, had a stereo EEG implant, had seizures recorded, but if you're used to looking at these things, you can see that the actual area of onset is not captured by their implant. This is later on, you can see that its propagation was there. Bottom line was they ended up doing a large laser ablation or controlled laser ablation in this area. They also did another study where they actually passed radio frequency current through the electrodes backwards to see if they could stop the seizures. It's not something we do here, and those electrodes aren't really built for it. The patient was not seizure-free. She improved a large amount, but she wasn't seizure-free. And then when she came back to us and we evaluated her again, we did reconstructions carefully of the images at the other institution at our place, modeled the dysplasia, and found that they really unfortunately missed a piece of the dysplasia with the implant and their ablation. This doesn't mean that the center did a bad job, but there are a lot of variables. Brain shifts during surgery with implants. There is a lot of difficulty in localizing, but there's a lot of room to improve these procedures and eventually make them much cleaner. And we believe, looking at some of the biomarker studies we're doing with spikes and seizures, that we likely will not have to precipitate seizures in the future, but activity between seizures may be enough to help us localize. So there's a lot of technology to go into here: stimulation, recording, mapping, focal ablations, which we think is coming in the future. Again, though, sharing this information among cases, we think could be extremely helpful. And this is just showing where they had missed the dysplasia with the electrodes, and then later on with the ablation. And so the whole idea of sampling error when we're looking at placing devices or doing therapies in the nervous system is key. There are limitations in the number of electrodes we can put in safely in regions because of risk of hemorrhage. With stereo EEG now, the risks are less than they were with grids and strips. But there are likely better ways to do this. And you all are familiar with technology from labs like Nick Malash's lab at Stanford, which shows that much smaller electrodes cause much less damage, injury, and hemorrhage. The problem is that when you get down into tens of microns, that they can't generate fields that are large enough, receptive or stimulation fields, to kind of map tissue on a clinical scale. So these are problems that need to be taken care of, but we're very interested in these and are spending a lot of time on that. And Flavia, working with different kinds of electrodes, is deeply embedded in this. What about our work in devices? So it's very clear that devices that are just either open loop and stimulate all the time, or devices that don't telemeter data out, or devices that don't learn, are probably not the future of what's going to happen in translational neuroengineering, although they're very important. And some, for example, Parkinson's stimulators, that are looking to block function in a particular area, can be quite useful, but they may not be the most efficient use of energy and technology. So when we talk about the last patient who has some intelligence behind algorithms to improve and optimize their work, we're seeing a big flood in epilepsy of different kinds of devices. So this is a study that I was involved in. The device was built on algorithms that we had worked on to predict seizures. It was implanted in 15 patients in Australia. And before that, we did a number of dogs here and at the University of Minnesota with epilepsy. And we did continuous recording. And actually, this library of recordings, it's continuous recording from 15 patients with epilepsy over up to 3 years per patient, is the richest data set of its kind in the world. We have it available on a cloud-based platform, but we're not allowed to publish it broadly because the technology is owned by LivaNova. The investigators in Australia at Melbourne who conducted the clinical trial with this company, the startup Neurovista, which no longer exists, unfortunately, allow people to collaborate with them, but we lose something by not being able to publish the data. One of the major findings, we were able to successfully predict seizures a half an hour in advance in a number of patients with this study, but probably one of the most useful findings was these are the number of days each of these 15 patients were recorded. These are the number of seizures that the patients reported in their diaries, and these are the number of seizures that the patients actually had. All anti-epileptic drug and device studies conducted and FDA approved, their efficacy is judged based upon these reported numbers in the patient's seizure diaries. And what you see is that they're not very worthwhile at all. Those of us who take care of people with epilepsy know that patients frequently, maybe up to half the time, don't know when they've had a seizure. But it works both ways. I mean, here's a patient that reported 3 seizures a month, but only had 0.6. because they were trying to infer it because they woke up in the morning and their tongue was sore, or they felt like they didn't sleep right, or the bedclothes were messed up or something. So in all of the technologies that we work on, there needs to be objective measurement of endpoints and results to guide therapy. So there are a number of devices that are coming along here. This UNEEG is a subscalp EEG monitoring device. People are using the NeuroPace responsive neurostimulator as a diagnostic device in many cases to record seizures. There's another one, EpiMinder, from the group in Melbourne, and Cochlear, that's a recording device that's subscalp. And there are a whole bunch of other wearable companies that are moving along to address this problem. Of course, therapeutics is really important. And this is just a paper that we put out in 2001. Marianne D'Alessandro and Rosanna Stella are my 2 first graduate students. Rosanna runs spinal cord stimulation for Boston Scientific now, and Marianne is running a large part of occupational health and safety for the CDC. With this idea of a responsive neurostimulation device, and NeuroPace now has been out for a number of years. It's in over 3,000 patients worldwide. And it actually is the first responsive device for epilepsy that telemeters data out. There are a number of open loop stimulation devices, that are being used for epilepsy as well. And that literature is moving forward. The question is, it's a real work in progress. The original design, so this is from Pensive, and this is just, we are able to take data, take it from we can't get it directly from the devices. We have to go to the company and get data dumps. And we're putting these data up, and you can see that here 5 stimulations in a row that doesn't stop the seizure here. And it turns out that this device does not stop seizures directly very often. It's very crude compared to other kinds of closed loop devices that don't look at phase. You know, it's not really clear. There isn't a gradient descent algorithm for judging how to adjust stimulation parameters. It's kind of done by thumb and by eye, and with a rep from the company who comes to every visit. But yet the patients improve over time. So this is one measure of, this is just line length, which is one of the measures that the features that's in the device that Rosanna developed as a graduate student. And it shows this measure of, you know, seizure activity. This is, you know, in January, I guess, like March of 2015. This is January of 2018, that it improves over time and the patient stabilizes. You can also see that there was a sudden change here when there was a change in the device and the battery. And then the patient unfortunately passed away. What can we learn from these changes in these devices? We now have data. Picture there are 3,000 patients worldwide, nationwide, that have these devices, but we're not learning from them as a whole. And it's difficult. The company won't allow the data to be aggregated because it's their largest asset. Individual centers can analyze it. The question is, how can we use some of the tools at our disposal to learn? So one of the first things we've done, you know, with just intracranial seizure data is to do crowdsourcing for seizure detection and prediction algorithms. And these are 2 papers we published a few years ago, one for detection and one for prediction. And the bottom line was that in 3 months, for a $15,000 prize, we got an area under the curve of almost 0.7. And in the previous 15 years, with $30 million of NIH funding across a number of centers, the performance was at least 20% worse than that. And that was because we could leverage the scientific community. The winners of these contests were not in the epilepsy field at all. They were data scientists. There's a learning point there. So we've been working, there's a, Greg Worrell leads the UH3 grant with the RC+S device, telemetering data out in dogs and now in people. We worked with them on the dog portion, taking the data up and trying to understand and annotate the data. And what we've been doing in trying to just pilot how we could analyze data across centers is that we've actually federated the analysis. So we've done the same protocols at each institution, put data in the same place, in different places, but in the same formats, and then run the same algorithms over these data. And Brittany Scheid, one of our graduate students who's about to graduate, did this study where she asked the question, before you even put a device in, why don't we quantitatively use the intracranial EEG and see if we can predict who's going to benefit from the device or not? And it turns out in one measure of synchronizability, the responders in blue were separable from the non-responders with an ROC that was on the order of, what's the broad, like on the gamma band, 0.83. So not perfect, but pretty promising. And it turns out that, you know, before you put somebody through getting a $35,000 device, plus the cost of implantation, plus the morbidity of putting the thing in and the pain, it would be nice to be able to predict the chances that they would respond. So I think this is quite promising. And what's interesting also is just looking at the small cohort. So we did this across Penn, UCSF, and NYU. You see that patients stratified. This is 50% reduction in seizures in the red dotted line. And you can see that there are a group of patients who are responders from the get-go. When you turn this thing on, and they might get a little bit better over time on average. There are patients who are not responders, period. And then there are ones who are bounce around, and eventually with this trial and error titration, the majority of them improve over time. So I think looking at data, trying to use computational models and quantitative criteria to figure out who gets a device or not and who's likely to respond is something that isn't done in our field typically, but it should be done. Now the decision is done at conference with a bunch of clinicians saying, well, we think they might benefit from this device. This is just Vikram Rao took over as the head of the Epilepsy Center at UCSF. Kate's taken over here. Dan is the heir apparent at NYU. I'm not going to push Oren out of a job there, but I mean, these younger people who are coming in, you know, it behooves us to train them. They're of a different mind. They're very interested in sharing data and pushing things forward. And so I'm quite excited about that. We've done some experiments where, you know, the goal is not only to get data from these devices in the population, but to take data out of these devices, take them up to the cloud, look at their performance, and change the algorithms gradually over time according to some reasonable rubric. And so we've done a couple of papers with Greg's group, with Mark Cook, with Tim, where we've actually taken data out of the devices and done this reprogramming. And we believe that we'll be able to do this with stimulation too. And so we've written a couple of these papers, and this is work in progress. The other issue that I'm interested in, so if you start to lump these things together, you know, looking at output from the devices, looking at clinical data, there's no doubt that there's a big movement now to using wearables and other sensors to guide neurostimulation. Something as simple, you know, in Tim Dennison's work, where he put a gravity sensor on the spinal cord stimulation device to change the current or the stimulation parameters depending upon whether the patient was laying down or standing up to improve efficacy and decrease uncomfortable side effects. We think it's really important in brain network disorders like epilepsy to understand how patient behavior changes their disorder. And so this is a grant that I have. It's a DP1 from the NIH, and it's to build an interface where patients can communicate directly with the devices that are implanted within them. And so we're looking at state space detection to understand that if the device sees a state which it thinks is permissive of seizures, it'll inform the patient and say, your seizure risk has just gone up. What are you doing? The patient might say, you know, I just had a beer, I'm visiting my mother-in-law, my dog just died, you know, I'm sleep deprived. And the device can learn these things over time and remind and warn the patient. The patient can also communicate with the device and say, you know what, I feel like I'm going to have a seizure. I don't feel well. Something's going on. And the device and the patient can teach each other over time to help improve the efficacy of the therapy and to help patients modify their behavior. And what the motivation for this originally for me was that one of my colleagues had a big MI and got an AICD put in, an implantable defibrillator. Went to his doctor who said, do you run on Wednesdays? My friend said, yeah, I do. And the doctor said, you know, when you run for over a half an hour, it looks like you start throwing arrhythmias that could kill you. That meeting with the doctor was 4 months after he started running. Why shouldn't the device say, you know what, I don't know what you're doing, but you need to stop doing that because you're going to end up killing yourself. So I think this is part of the future that integrates the data sharing, the algorithms, the cloud computing, the kind of smart confluence on parameters. So we started a number of years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, with the U24 grant, which was meant, its milestones were to get 100 labs to work together to share data and collaborate on research. And we built this platform, IEEG.org, which is self-sustaining now, and it has over 5,000 groups worldwide that are working on it. They're spread all over. One of the things of note, just looking at what's going on in the world today, is if you take a look at the amount of collaboration and places where people are working, There's a lot of socioeconomic influence, but there also is real isolation. You see almost no one in Russia who's using this. And that kind of isolation just gives us pause. A lot of people in China, Japan, Korea, India, places you might perceive, even in Cleveland. So the new version of that is Pensive, and I've mentioned this, and this is just a little bit of what the interface looks like. And you know, Zach Ives and I and a couple of other folks have really been interested in building this open data ecosystem for the neurosciences. And the question is, how do you accelerate science by getting people to share data? And the answer is we need to change incentives dramatically. So I actually proposed to the Institute of Medicine a while back, creating something called an S index, sort of like an H index, but for data. And it's a sharing index, and you would be credited and calculated. Your S index would be calculated based upon how many people actually use your data. And if you were promoted, partially based upon your S index. If you were funded, partially based upon your S index, then there would be incentives to share data across institutions rather than hold it close and not accelerate science. And I think there's real promise there. So Pensive allows you to post data sets, to share them. It gives them the DOI. You can quote them. Here's an example of one that's just placed. Talks about, it gives an overview, the files, the data formats, tells you what to read. There's a README that explains it all. And then this is what the reference looks like with the DOI to publish. And we think that over time, that data has a lifespan. It will sit, and if people use it, it should stay and perpetuate. And maybe there's an amount of money that's attached to every grant for data sharing to sustain this. If it's not used in a long time, it kind of drifts off to, you know, tape back up and eventually maybe off the grid. And then if you need to bring it back, then you pay to restore. And we think that the annotation of important data sets will kind of be like Waze, where people who use it will kind of leave their directions and thoughts and observations on it over time. So, I mean, I've kind of given you a little bit of the world as I see it right now, but I think that we need to have standards. I don't think there's going to be one data platform, but there needs to be a way to find data on the web. And it may be that every data set that's from a funded grant should have a uniform data label, like food has labels on it, to enable you to find it and then request permission to use it and share it. There need to be interoperable platforms. There need to be tools for federated analysis. And if you take a look at these 4 patients that I presented to you early on, the major impediments, some of them are technical, right? I mean, we need better ways of mapping epileptic networks and treating them, but a lot of them are political. So I'm very interested in doing something aggressive, pilots, getting public and private funding to share epilepsy implant data. So I have a grant to share data among institutions. I can pay for each data set and get places to put them up. And the criteria or the rules are that if you put up one data set, then you can analyze all of them. And there are no time limits. So it's not like I'm going to aggregate the data and keep it, but anybody can use it. But I think we could do this with a variety of other device programs and illnesses as well. So major themes: rigorous quantitative therapies are coming, devices, minimally invasive surgery, data sharing, collaborating, cloud incentives. And really, you know, I'm in the engineering school, and one of the most common outcomes for our bioengineering students is to go to medical school. We're raising a generation of much more technically savvy physicians. We're also, I mean, I'm, you know, talking to one of the meccas for neuroengineering, but you have a lot of savvy, clinically savvy engineers, and I think that cross-pollination is key. So here's my funding, some private funding, some of the NIH grants. One of my grants comes from the family of this fellow. This is Michel Morawski, who invented the implantable defibrillator. Just of interest, he came up with this idea when he was working at a little hospital, Sinai Hospital of Baltimore. He went to Hopkins and they laughed at him. He did all of the work in the basement of that community hospital with some engineers from the Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. And Hopkins eventually was the place where the first one was implanted. So it's quoted as being invented there. There are a lot of lessons about the grit that this guy had and what he was able to accomplish. So that's all I have for you. I'm happy to take any questions.
That was fantastic, Brian. Thank you. Really, questions for Brian?
Wasn't technical enough, was it? Steve, not enough meat to bite into?
It was perfect, Brian. It looks like Andy's got a question.
I do. Can I unmute? I can. I want to go back, Brian, to your epilepsy reduction stuff. I have a question about kind of what it means to reduce the how many seizures do you have to eliminate, or what percentage of seizures in somebody's life do you have to eliminate to make a meaningful impact on their quality of life? Do they have to be like, you know, if I can't drive because I'm having seizures, and you eliminate half of my seizures, I still can't drive. Like, but I'm curious, are there other areas where that quality of life becomes an important issue? And well, so is zero the goal, or is it just a reduction? And how do you figure that out for each patient and physician?
Right. So that's really hard. And I think that it's variable from patient to patient. If you're somebody who has 30 seizures a week, going down to 15 seizures a week probably isn't going to be a big change for you. If you can turn somebody from having convulsions to staring spells where the health risks are less, that's a big improvement. If you can take somebody and make their seizures nocturnal, then they can drive, which is what happened, by the way, to this patient who I presented where the dysplasia was missed. So her seizures are all nocturnal now, and it's dramatically changed her life. And she has them like every 3 months, but they're milder. It's a really tough question, and we get into these discussions all the time, and that's why not every patient is a good candidate for a device that, you know, if the average reduction in seizures is 70%, which it is for our best devices, that may not be a great sell to somebody. You know, if they're a busy executive who wants to be able to drive a car, they may not want to take the chances of surgery to do that. You asked like a fundamental question, and I can't answer it to you. I mean, the thing that it does translate into is, you know, what kind of performance metric is good enough to approve a device, right? Is 50% of the patients getting a 50% reduction? I mean, that's kind of like the gold standard for a lot of therapies. For drugs, you know, 30% responders is a big deal. But the more invasive the device, the better the performance has to be adopted.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about the risk calculation that you do with your patient for the surgery itself, right?
Yeah, the surgeries are pretty safe. I mean, a few percent risk of a serious adverse event, but they're a pain. You know, it's weeks of time, effort, and recovery for many of these things. If you're going to have multiple procedures and then a NeuroPace implant and stuff like that, I mean, that's pretty invasive.
Yeah. Thanks.
Monique.
Hi, Brian. Nice to see you again.
Likewise.
So I've been puzzled by the same question you raised, which has to do with how come after many years of electrical stimulation, the percentage of seizures keeps going down. We're talking 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 70% reduction down from say 50%. So there's an improvement over time, but going to the American Epilepsy Society, every company that does that has the same results. VNS, same thing. Santé, same thing. I'm wondering what if some underlying mechanism there that's just not necessarily stimulation related.
Yeah, so Dominique, I couldn't agree with you more. Now, VNS is not as good as the other two. It's not that much different, but it's probably not as good. But
I've seen up to 65, 70% reduction after 8 years advertised.
You know, the other problem though, Dominique, is that we don't really know what the denominator is, because we rely on patient reporting. And these devices, the NeuroPace device, you know, buffers like 3 or 5 events and then you have to download. So it throws away all the other ones and it counts them. It counts long epochs. It won't save the data. It'll just say we saved a long epoch, but in a lot of patients, they're not seizures. So I think that we don't know the denominator very well, but you're right. I mean, the patients still say they were falling down and they're not falling down now. I have no idea. No idea. And I think it's a major issue, and people talk about neuroplasticity, you know, maybe it's affecting that, but it's crazy that we do all this stuff. And now the big thing is the companies are pushing thalamic implant and stimulation. So there's some data for this, but I was told by one of the reps the other day that there's something like 200 patients with NeuroPace devices that have thalamic implants in them. But there's yet to be, you know, a prospective study of this. I mean,
do you mean the STAMPEDE trial, the anterior nucleus of the thalamus? Is that what you mean? Or something
no,
else?
they're putting electrodes in patients with responsive neurostimulators in the thalamus.
In the thalamus, I see.
And some of them are in
Wow.
AN, some of them are in CM, some of them are in dorsal medial thalamus. And our field is kind of the Wild West.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. You've been working on this a long time, and the problem is you're a scientist.
I am. Why is that a problem?
No, it's not a problem, but what we need to bring that kind of rigor to the patient care, right?
Right. It's so right now it sounds like a bit more of a fishing sort of expedition. Oh, let's try this, let's try that.
Yeah, the problem is that the people who they're fishing with, I mean, it's difficult, but these patients are desperate. And you know what? I mean, they do get a response to the devices, but not nearly, you know, like the cardiac world can't work that way, right? We need to we're still many years behind them.
Correct. Yeah, I agree.
Carl.
Yeah, I enjoyed this talk a lot. Thank you so much. Maybe your comment to Dominique is a segue to my question. When you said he was a scientist, we all know that it's going to take a village to solve many of the challenges that you highlighted. And it's going to take cooperation and collaboration between scientists, researchers, clinicians, as well as healthcare systems, insurance, payers, and the private sector as well. And we all know that when we have good intentions and we're up to doing good science and we make discoveries, we're allowed to fish around, make expeditions, and get excited about science. But the closer we get to a real solution, this is when the stakes become really high and the stakeholders have different incentives. So I wonder how you've been able to solve these issues, or approach them at least.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult thing, you know. So as I mentioned before, and I wasn't kidding, you know, money hasn't been my main motivation. We publish all of our data. We publish our algorithms, you know, and I think it's just a matter of your motivation. You know, it's very few people that get rich off of, I mean, so, right, if you talk about economic conflict of interest, that's one, right? And that's pretty straightforward. I think, you know, I was terribly excited when NeuroPace licensed those algorithms. 35,000 options I had in that company. That company went public for $25 a share. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Except that I had to convert the options like within a few years after when they were issued. That cost me 10 grand. And then there was, because of the duration, a reverse split of 260 to 1. So the 35,000 shares that I had are now worth about $1,200 that I paid $10,000 for 15 years ago. What's the lesson there? The lesson there is that that's not the right motivation. I have a day job. I get paid well. I live pretty well. And the motivation is to try to improve that. So we would like to get these algorithms and we would like to get the data and the stimulation parameters available and let real control engineers look at, I mean, there should be gradient descent methods to derive the best stimulation parameters. I mean, Dominic could do this in his sleep, and so could a bunch of other people on this call, right? You just need the data in front of you. I care about the patients. So I think I'm trying to educate these people, you know, the people I train, that don't think about getting rich. Think about, you know, accomplishing something that's important. Because if you do, you'll benefit. I was promoted based upon that. You know, I've gotten to other positions, and that's the long game. The other stuff, and let me tell you, I suffered from so many conflict of interest, you know, events because of those shares that I had in NeuroPace. I couldn't participate in any of the trials. I couldn't do any of that stuff here at the university because of that. So it turned out to be kind of a waste of time. I should have never, the financial part was a waste of time. I should have just focused on the science. So I think just trying to teach people that. Now, professional conflict of interest is a different thing. Like, you want it to work so that you can get promoted and stuff like that. But I think more and more the academic community they realize, you see giants who tumble because they don't disclose or because they've done something that's fraudulent, and those are big lessons. So all I can say is, I mean, I try to navigate these things. I mean, Dominic, you've been doing this for a long time. I mean, there are other people I don't know as well. And you balance these conflicts, but the science always has to be paramount, and the patients have to be paramount. You know, my patients die. One of them died this morning. You know, I haven't called the family yet. And like, that's real. She was 40 and healthy except for her seizures. That's a mess.
Yeah, I appreciate the insight. Perhaps.
Sorry about that. I didn't tell you anything, really, did I?
No, you did. I mean, you don't have good answers for these questions, but even at the basic level where we all would love to share our data, they actually don't belong to us as investigators, unless maybe we get a grant from the NIH that says the data belongs to the public space, then we can argue with that. But we all belong to institutions that hold our data. I wouldn't say hostage, but it's proprietary data, as much as we would love as researchers to share them and learn from each other.
But I will say, if we build platforms that you use every day, like some of the Brain Initiative grants, they tell you that you have to put your data in Endar or some other place, and it's just extra effort. But if we're smart and build things like Jupyter notebooks that have these things attached to them that you use every day, and it turns out to be really beneficial for you, and then that translates across places. So we had originally spun out a company, Blackfin, to build this data platform. We were going to do it for academia. Well, of course, you know, it gets in the hands, the people who run the company want to, making $10 million enough a year wasn't enough for them. They wanted $1 billion company. And so we let them go on their way, and they're gone now. It doesn't exist anymore. And we decided to pull it back to the university and make it open source, because that'll have impact. And the other one had zero impact, right? So I think they're lessons. The question is, how can we take the lessons we've learned and not let the people we're training make the same stupid mistakes, right?
Agreed.
Hello, Krishnan, please.
Thanks, Dr. Lick, for a wonderful talk. I am a research scientist with the Cleveland Clinic Epilepsy Center. So your work has been a lot of inspiration to many engineers like me. So my question is regarding the responder, non-responders in the NeuroPace data that you showed. First of all, my question is, how do you define responder, non-responder? And second, when we do NeuroPace, it usually takes time. It's like months, years or 1 or 2 years. So, and during this time, medication also changes, right? So how do we disentangle this, medication, neurostimulation, and control all these variables when you do a scientific study? And how do we, understand whether this effect is due to the medication or due to neuromodulation?
Yeah, so, that's the $1 million question. The answer is you let scientists run it. You don't have clinicians go, I think I'll change this to 6. There needs to be an organized, standardized, scientific approach to manipulating the parameters and taking care of the patients. And it doesn't exist right now. And I think we need N. You need a large number of patients and a large amount of data to be able to make sense of some of that stuff. And you need accurate reporting and counts. So I think you don't have appropriate information. You've got lack of standardized clinical protocols and even the measures. So it turns out the FDA doesn't use the recordings from the device for patient reporting. It's patient diaries. So it's a mess. I mean, I shouldn't say it's a mess. It could be better organized so that more science could be done on it, right?
That's true. I mean, like if you look at NeuroPace data, the number of seizures that is patient reported and the NeuroPace collected is totally different. It's way more. So, and it doesn't make sense to actually have the patient reported data as a viable marker, but that is the world right now. So anyway, so we will change over time.
Well, we'll talk to you about aggregating data. Again, we can't aggregate it, but I think we can federate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to ask one last question, Brian. So I had a chance meeting with an alum, a BME alum of our department who works for Verily. And he said that it was his understanding that across several of their, sub companies, that they were trying to build effectively a Google Maps for the healthcare industry. Do you know anything about this? Is that,
I've heard rumblings, and they actually came and talked to a leadership group here. I don't know much about it, Bob, except that I think a lot of people are afraid to trust them with their stuff.
I think that was my my initial sort of really. Anyway, I just was curious because they have deep pockets, and they have more of a business motive here, I'm sure. But I just was curious if there's some synergy.
Yeah, I think IBM is looking. Watson has not succeeded yet. They came and talked to us. We'll give you money, we'll give you our computing devices, we'll give you programmers, help us develop products. And the institution said, we don't need your money, we don't need your programmers. We want to do what we think is important, not develop new products. But there is this weird divide, right? The purpose of academia is to understand, develop science, understand mechanisms, and to discover things that will help people. The goal of industry is to take that science and take those discoveries and turn them into stuff that you can actually use. And that interface doesn't work nearly as well as it should, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there should be a direct line from like discoveries to stuff, but I think universities want to really monetize their discoveries, and companies want to really protect their financial interests on the stuff, and it's not very efficient, right? I don't know.
Kind of another thing popped into my mind, and this is data sharing agreements on grants. You said some of the BRAIN initiative things require you to upload your data, but I can't tell you how many study sets. First of all, they're not part of the scoring, right? The data sharing, and people will say, well, this, I'll just give some examples. We have too small of a patient population. They're going to be identifiable. People don't know how to use the data properly. And if we put it out there, it'll get misused. I mean, there are a whole lot of these reasons. I don't know. What's your opinion about this?
I think it's malarkey. I mean, I think that if somebody publishes on your data, then they need to outline their analyses in a way that make them reproducible. And if they don't, it shouldn't be published. So I think there needs to be more rigor in publication. And I think it should just be required, but it's not going to happen unless you incentivize people to do it. And it's not going to happen unless you make it simple.
Yeah.
And so, if I want code from you and we're both using Python or MATLAB, it's pretty easy. It's interchangeable, works, you send me your code. I think the other issue is there just for something that valuable and where privacy is an issue is there needs to be an honest, unbiased broker. And maybe it's the National Library of Medicine.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's some public-private partnership where the universities establish this entity and they each run an instance of it behind their firewall and the data can be analyzed that way. I mean, I'm just not sure what the right answer is, but there's clearly something better than what we're doing.
Yeah, I bet I've marked 75% of all grants I've ever reviewed for NIH as unsatisfactory on their data sharing. And I don't think I've had any impact. So maybe, they're going to have to, the attitude's going to have to change.
I think they're looking for a new data czar. Maybe I should, data Nazi, maybe I should be no, I don't know. Probably not. I'm too soft.
You have to focus on that U-54, Brian. You don't need another job.
All right, let's get it first. We'll see. We've got Andy there. He's a secret weapon. He and Steve, they'll be all over that.
So I
All right,
like
this
the
is
device, Brian, that you can talk to and give you answers for that stimulation. So, I like Alexa is with Google. I think that device should have a voice name, and that would be Brian. Brian, I think I'm going to have a seizure.
Right.
What should I do?
Right. And it'll say, Dominique, your hair is terrible. I don't.
Well, I just came back from writing. So.
No. It's good. It's good. Yeah, we'll see. The nice thing is I don't think any of us are going to be out of a job anytime soon. But I think we could be so much more efficient about what we do. And I don't think it's rocket science. I just think so when we started with this Blackfin thing, the corporate people said, there's no market for this. Like, this isn't a drug, give me like Viagra. I'm like, yeah, right. But it turns out there is a market. Like Blackfin had contracts from the government. I don't know how many of you are on Spark, but you're putting data in Pensive now. Now, it might be a real pain, and it may not be at the point yet where you use it every day for your stuff, but that's the idea. Make tools that people can use every day that facilitate sharing. So we'll work on that. I'll get back to you next week about it.
Yeah. All right, Brian, I think we've held you hostage long enough. Thank you very much for speaking today. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Yep.
It's going to cost you that beer, Bob.
I can do that.
All right.
All right.
care.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
bye.
Bye.
See ya. Bye.